Hello everyone! So today I'm taking a suggestion from off of my social media, particularly I think this one came from Facebook, to discuss different types of modern folk belief that are given this sort of fake backstory to imply that they're really old, but they are not. And the reason I want to talk about this is because we do see this quite a bit, and it's something that has been much worse and much more common, I think, over the last 10 or 20 years, particularly with social media getting as popular as it is and sort of the internet getting as messy as it is. So it's important to be aware of sort of where ideas are coming from and also what the older ideas actually were. Because one of the problems that happens, one of the things that I'm seeing, is this new folklore is coming out that is given this fake backstory. People say that it's Irish or Celtic or just old traditional folk belief, and that doesn't get questioned. People just believe, then okay, then that's the case. And it's actually overwriting the older material. It's replacing the older beliefs. Usually this is coming out of the United States, but it is having effects in other places, including Ireland. I have seen younger people in Ireland repeating things that I know for certain are coming from very modern, not Irish perspectives, but they're repeating it as if it's an Irish folk belief. And arguably, if people in Ireland believe it, it would be considered an Irish folk belief. But it's not an older one, and it's not sort of the widely accepted version. So before I get into the rest of this, I do want to be clear. Folklore is a fluid and constantly evolving thing. There really is no basic folklore that doesn't change or grow or adapt over time. Folklore is not something that it gets written in a book once and then that is the end of it, and that is what everyone believes forever from that point on. It just does not work that way. A lot of what I do from a more academic perspective is look at the way that particular folk beliefs have adapted and changed, how they have been taken out of their culture of origin and then rewritten and spread as a new version of that folk belief. So this is something I've kind of looked at really in depth, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. And I have 5 or 6 examples I want to go over of this. I'm going to talk about sort of what the original belief is in the original culture, and then where that changed, and then what sort of the modern idea or belief is. I want to be clear, though, that just because it's a modern folk belief, just because it's a new version, it doesn't make it bad, it doesn't make it wrong. If that's what you want to believe, by all means, continue to believe it. Just be aware that it is not older, usually than the last 10 years or so, that it is a new idea and new folklore, and often that it doesn't come from where it says that it's coming from. A lot of this is material, honestly, coming from like Dungeons and Dragons and fiction, but a lot of it is material that when it first was being spread as what we would have previously referred to as fake lore, which is material that is written as fiction, usually, but then is spread or put out there as folklore. And there's a great example of this. It was not meant to be fake lore by the person who wrote it, but it gets spread around constantly now. I see it all the time. And that is definitely what we would consider it to be. And it is the skipping rhyme that you will see usually in a screenshot. It originated on Twitter, and it's someone talking about the skipping rhyme has to do with effectively punishing creepy men, I think is what it boils down to. I'm not going to quote it here, but it was written as part of a wider fiction project. It is attributed then as being a traditional skipping rhyme in, what sounds like it would be like an older English town or area. That older English town or area name is entirely invented by the author. She wrote it to be creative, honestly, as this little creative poem thing, and then attributed it to this fictitious world that she writes about. Everyone who saw it screen capped it and then shared it as a traditional skipping rhyme from England, which it is not. And again, this is why I say we would call this fake lore, where it is something that is put out as folklore that is not folklore. It is creative fiction. And again, the issue with this comes in not only with people then spreading it and believing that this is genuinely older material, but also with the way this pushes out the actual older material. These new ideas are not inherently bad or wrong, but they tend to be very loud. They tend to be shared around a lot on social media, and they're kind of quickly overwriting, there's no other way to put it, and changing the folklore as it exists in specific places. So another example I'll give really quickly, this is not from my list, but just something that happened recently. I had seen a really funny video on TikTok of this woman pretending to jump into this Neolithic stone circle, talking about, oh, the fairies taking her away, which is fine. It was a really funny video. But I know how these things work, hence why I'm making this video. And I knew that a lot of people would see the funny video and then immediately assume and associate the Neolithic stone circles with fairy rings or fairy circles, because that's what the video was joking about. And they are not. They are a very separate thing in folk belief. So I did a little stitch to that and just said, it's funny, but so we're clear, like a fairy ring or a fairy circle would be a ring of mushrooms or darker grass or dead grass or flowers or trees. It's kind of a separate thing. The stone circle would be something else. And unfortunately for me, I shared this on Instagram and then it went a little bit viral. And I was getting a lot of people jumping in. I will say mostly people in the US jumping in to say that I was wrong and that stone circles are fairy circles and, that I shouldn't be correcting other people's beliefs. And here's the issue with that. So as I mentioned, stone circles are not fairy circles. That is something different. It is possible that there is folklore about stone circles in particular places that I don't personally tend to look at the folklore from, that for whatever reason would call them fairy circles. I can pretty confidently say in Ireland and the UK, in northern Brittany, and from what I know of like Germanic and Swedish and Icelandic beliefs, in Sweden, I do believe they will call them witch rings or witch circles, and they have a similar folk belief, but it's witches and not fairies that are doing it. But either way, the idea of a fairy ring or an elf ring or a fairy circle, an elf circle, whatever we want to call it, has always sort of been based on the idea that this is a place where the good folk were dancing. They do ring dances, which is an older style of dance, and that after they have done this particular types of vegetation will grow up where this occurred, where this happened. And then there's all sorts of related folk beliefs about fairy circles. I'm not going to get into that or I'm going to get really sidetracked. But the point is, it was always the idea that this was an organic thing that happened to indicate that the good folk had danced there. The idea that those would be stone circles immediately kind of raises a bunch of questions, I think, about how the stones would appear overnight like that. Also, why they would appear when the fairies have danced there, why they aren't covering the landscape, because fairies do love to dance in folklore. Why it would be stone circles in some cases, but plants in others. I think it raises a lot of logic puzzles. But the wider point here is just that is not what the folklore is. The older folk belief has always been that it was vegetation, fairies dancing, etc. The idea that it would be stone circles seems to be something really new that is coming about mostly from people who don't know the older folk beliefs, who aren't familiar with them. Now, I'm not saying that there is no one anywhere in Ireland or England or Scotland or Wales or wherever that would say that, yes, a stone circle is a fairy ring. But I have never personally heard anyone in any of those places saying those things. I am really familiar with what fairy rings actually are. I have never until recently seen the idea that it would be stone circles. Some people were definitely confusing them with fairy forts in Ireland, which are made of stone, but again, very different concept. That would be a place where the fairies live, not a place where they just danced for one night. And I did see some people also kind of confusing the idea based on Outlander. I've not actually watched Outlander, so just keep that in mind before I say this. But there were people commenting that basically in Outlander she goes into a stone circle and leans against a stone or touches a stone or whatever and is transported back in time. therefore that they would be fairy rings or fairy circles. But again, that's not even what fairy rings do. Like, you might get pulled into the world of fairy. You might get dragged into a fairy dance, which is not going to end well for you most of the time. But they're not just random portals in the older folk belief. Again, I realize there is modern folk belief that says that they are portals, but they're not usually just random portals back in time or random portals that like humans can use to transfer different places. So we kind of see the way that modern media, TV shows, modern concepts, and just confusion, a lack of familiarity with the older beliefs, is causing this new idea to come about. And I'm using that as an example again, just of sort of what we're talking about in general here, and the way that folk beliefs change, but also the way those changes sometimes conflict with the older folk beliefs. So, that all said, that was a very long introduction. I'm going to dive right into it here. I have, I think, 5 different topics that I wanted to get to. So the first one I want to touch on is cold iron. And I want to start with cold iron because I see this coming up all the time. I understand why most people are not familiar with the older concept, but it has definitely become so widespread in the newer version that it is pushing out the older understanding, which causes a lot of confusion than if you look at the older sources. So cold iron is something you will see referenced as a protection against fairies going back hundreds of years at least. Cold iron itself is not specific to fairies. It is an archaic term for any bladed weapon made of iron or steel, which is what bladed weapons pretty much would have been made of a few hundred years ago. When you see people talking about cold iron, they usually mean either a sword or a dagger or knife, something along those lines. And we find references to this in all sorts of poetic places. It was sort of a poetic term. And we do find references to fairies being warded off by cold iron. Again, this would have been a blade or a knife. It is very straightforward. The modern term you found in the 20th century was cold steel, and that would have meant a gun. So it's really any weapon made of that material. And that's it. Like I said, very simple, very straightforward. What happened, though, is in the 1980s or 90s, Dungeons and Dragons had some settings that involved fairies, the fae, those sorts of beings. And it would have been really logistically messy for the game if they had every iron weapon affecting their fae beings in this protective warding off kind of way, because obviously a lot of their weapons are iron. It would give significant advantages to any characters that had any iron weapon. Also, if you're playing a fae character, it would cause your character a lot of problems. So they kind of separated the two out. They had iron as one thing, but then they had cold iron as this special thing, this special material that was forged in a very particular way with less heat, or cold forged, and that would explain why cold iron, this specially forged type of iron, would have a strong effect on fae beings, but regular iron would not. And this idea has actually become so widespread, you will sometimes find even people who are blacksmiths passing this on as if this is ancient blacksmith folklore, and it is very much not. It comes from Dungeons and Dragons. And it became this widespread idea that when you need iron to ward off fairies, you don't just need any iron. Not any iron will do. Like, you can't pull a fork out of your silverware drawer, because fun fact, those are made from steel, and use that to ward off the fairies. That it has to be this special iron, this cold forged cold iron. And we kind of have seen that belief becoming more and more widespread when, again, the older folk belief, and this is still the belief in many places, is just literally anything made of iron. That fork will protect you from the fairies, basically. At least, with the older folklore. So the idea that cold iron is this cold forged material that is especially made is really new. Yes, you will run across people, even people who are blacksmiths, sharing this idea as if it is very old. It simply just is not. This is the newer folklore that has come about, but you need to know what the older meaning is if you're going to do any kind of research or study any of the older sources, because it's going to be very, very confusing for you when you suddenly run across this reference to cold iron in, a poem from 200 years ago, warding off the fairies, and you're thinking, well, where did they get this magical cold forged iron? And the story literally just means they pulled like their eating dagger from their belt, to ward, off the fairies that were harassing them. So important context, and that is cold iron. And the new folklore versus kind of the older folklore. The older folk belief is coming from a lot of different cultures. You'll find it in Ireland, you'll find it in Wales and Scotland. I think they also particularly emphasize black-handled knives as warding off fairies or having a special power over fairies. But it's just the idea that cold iron is an iron weapon is pretty old and pretty widespread. The idea that it is specially cold forged material is very new and comes from Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, not that it's right or wrong, just that is where it's from. So another thing that I want to talk about, which is also Dungeons and Dragons related, is terms you'll run across like the Feywild, Arcadia, Kithian. Anytime you see terms like that, and you will see them coming up with people talking about fairies or people talking about fairy folklore, those are directly from various Dungeons and Dragons or some White Wolf games like Changeling coming in. But those are terms that were used in gaming and are not originally from folklore. They were created for these games and have since been kind of taken and adapted and are used by some people. People will refer to the world of fairy as the Feywild or as Arcadia. And the Feywild comes from D&D, Arcadia comes from White Wolf's Changeling game, just to be clear. But they are terms that are coming from role-playing games and are now being used and incorporated. They're the language that people are familiar with, so those are the words that they use. Just important to be aware of that source. If you want to use those terms, use those terms. Do whatever you want to do. But don't expect them to show up in Irish folklore. Don't expect them to show up in any sort of older material because they're just not older terms. They're just new. And again, there's nothing wrong with them being new. Just be aware if you're using them that you're using something that is drawn from these particular role-playing games. That also is something I will use sometimes in conversations with people when I'm trying to get a feel for where they're coming from. Because people will like aggressively come into conversations talking about how everybody knows that, this belief or that belief is ancient and folklore about fairies and, blah, blah, blah. But then they'll be using these terms from role-playing games, which kind of tells me where they're drawing the bulk of their material from. It gives me a place to sort of try to meet them in the middle. I emphasize try. So nothing wrong with using them. Just be aware that's where they're coming from. And if you look at older material, you're going to find, in a lot of cases, very different concepts. Another one I want to talk about, the third one on our little list today, is the idea of fairies stealing your name, literally taking your name. I don't know for sure this started in gaming. It has definitely worked its way into gaming at this point. This is something I started to see probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more like 10 because time is meaningless, but relatively recently. And I remember being very baffled when I was first running across it. The idea that if you tell your name to a fairy, that they will literally steal your name. Your name will now be their name and you now don't have a name. The older folk belief is that you don't want to give your name, you don't want to tell your name to fairies because it gives them power over you. Your name is like a little piece of you, a little piece of your soul. And if they have that name, then they have power over you. It's the same reason in a lot of stories you will see fairies not wanting to give their own names, that they'll use aliases or nicknames, or they'll give you sort of the symbolic interpretation of their name instead of literally just telling you what their name is. The idea being that if you as a human have their name, you have power over them. So the folkloric concept, sort of older, wider belief, would be that your name has power, it provides people power over you, And that's why you don't want the good folk to have this. You would want to give them an alias. Humans can lie, so you can really tell them whatever you want to tell them. There's a pretty widespread story in Ireland, and I believe this is in Scotland as well, of a girl who was kind of being stalked by one of the good folk, was in a position where she was boiling water and he was being super creepy. He asked her what her name was, and she said her name was myself, Misha, M-I-S-E in the Irish. I believe there's an English version of this where she says Ainsley, which is just a dialect for own self, like my own self, Ainsley. And he then gets aggressive with her. She douses him in the boiling water. He runs off and is then, dying from his wounds. And another of the good folk, usually his mother in the story, comes to him and is like, "Who did this to you? Who did this to you? I will get revenge for you." And of course, all he can say is, "Myself did this." So it saves her from being harmed because she gave him a fake name. In that situation. So this is sort of where the idea of being careful around your name around fairies comes from. It's what we have in the older material. What we start to see coming in, though, is this idea that they literally take your name. And again, this is not that this is wrong. This is modern folklore. But it is important to be aware that this is a newer idea. This is not the older traditional material. If you believe that you actually are encountering one of the good folk and you give them your full legal birth name because you want them to take it away from you, we have this conflict, and I mentioned this earlier, that this is what happens sometimes with the newer stuff. From the older folk belief, you have just made a huge mistake and given them complete total power over your life. In the newer folk belief, the idea is then this takes the power away from that name so that it's no longer connected to you. I always would tend to err on the side of the older widespread folk belief because that's clearly where I'm coming from myself. But we are seeing this really interesting contrasting thing happening, where this new very widespread belief is you give them your name and they take it away from you and it's now their name. Older belief is very different. On a similar note, and this isn't on my list, but I'm just going to mention it, I've seen some fiction going around about selkies where, someone in a cafe or something, sees a woman come in and drop her coat and picks it up and hands it back to her, and then the woman gets all flustered and then shows up the next day or shortly thereafter and is basically like, "Well, I'm a selkie and that was my sealskin coat and you picked it up and gave it back to me, so now we're married." That is 100% not how that original folklore actually works. In the older stories, the selkie's skin would be stolen, usually by a fisherman, and then she would have no choice. She'd be forced to go with him and marry him until she could steal her coat back. Very different concept than what sort of the newer fiction is about. The newer stories, which are fiction, I want to emphasize, these are being written as fiction, not by people who believe in any of this. They just think it's a cute way to rewrite the story to give the selkie more power. I don't personally see how it does give them more power because they're still stuck with marrying a total stranger just because the stranger gave them the coat back instead of stealing it. That's my personal quibble with this. But nonetheless, you will run across this online sometimes, and people arguing that you can earn yourself a selkie spouse by returning their coat to them. It's just an inverse of what the older folk belief actually is. So, getting through those two things, I want to touch on two others, one of which I know is going to be controversial, and one of which people might not be as familiar with because it's a newer one I've kind of seen floating around. So the Banhin fairy, B-E-A-N, Bon, it means woman, F-H-I-O-N-N in this case, because it's a grammatical thing. The word would normally just be F-I-O-N-N, but F-H-I-O-N-N, white, the color white. So literally would translate as like white woman. There is some really old folklore that connects this to maybe the Banshee or the Watcher at the Ford kind of a being. But what you will see is modern accounts claiming that the Banhin fairy is like a water hag that drowns people, particularly children. And they will swear that this is the Irish version of this being, that she's called Jenny Greenteeth in England. She's called hags in England more generally, different names in different places. They'll also, strangely, in my opinion, tie her to the Germanic Wissenfrau, white women, which are very different energy and don't usually make a habit of drowning people as far as I know. But this all kind of gets lumped together, and they'll say that the Beanhian is the Irish version of the white woman fairy concept found in other cultures. She's dangerous and drowns children. None of that is from any kind of actual Irish folk belief. Even still today, it gets passed around mostly in non-Irish sources. And it is coming from Dane McCoy's book from the 1990s or early 2000s, A Witch's Guide to the Fairy Folk. I strongly discourage people from using that book as a source pretty much ever for anything. It has a lot of misinformation in it. This is just one example, but there's a lot going on in there that has no actual connection to any of the cultures that the author was saying they were coming from. So the Beanhian fairy is one good example of this. You will run across this online, you will run across this in social media, even in some books. It has been incorporated. This is actually an entertaining thing. So it started, as far as I know, with Dan McCoy. That was the earliest source I found that talks about this. But it has since been taken into gaming. And so now we see this weird, like it's showing up on gaming websites, listed exactly as McCoy described it, as this Irish hag that drowns children kind of fairy. But it is definitely coming from McCoy's book and then being incorporated out from there into both gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, and also into some corners of modern folklore. If you want to believe that there's a fairy called the White Woman who drowns children, by all means, again, new folklore, do what you're going to do. But it is not Irish. It is not coming from Irish culture. It is being given an Irish name, probably to make it seem more legitimate, but it is not something that actually exists within older Irish folklore or even modern Irish folklore as far as I'm aware. As I said, there is a loose concept of the Beanhian fairy, or the Beanhian, I should say, being connected possibly to the Banshee or similar types of beings like the washerwoman. But that would be a wholly different sort of thing. They're not associated with living in rivers or lakes. They don't drown children. They really, for the most part, don't directly kill people, mostly. I don't want to digress too much into the Banshee, but just that's something to keep in mind when you run across this stuff. My rule of thumb is pretty much always when you see things being attributed as Irish folklore or old folklore, particularly if it's just general, this is old folklore, always double check it. Always try to do a little research on your own to find out where these things are coming from, because they are rarely coming from the sources that they say that they're coming from. So finally, I want to wrap this up. This is the one I said was going to be a little controversial, with talking a bit about changelings. Because this has become very widespread. This is probably the most common thing you'll run across today that is an example of new adapted folklore and not the original, but is being put out there as the original older folklore. So changelings are beings that are found from the medieval period forward across pretty much all of Europe. There are ideas of changelings in a multitude of cultures, from Germany to Sweden, to Ireland, to Iceland, Scotland, England, France, everywhere, all over. And the idea with the changeling was that the fairies swapped a healthy human, this could be an infant, a child, an adult, there was no age limit on this, for something else. And that something else might be an inanimate object that has magically been disguised as a stolen human. It might be an old fairy that is looking for a cushy human world retirement plan and is disguising itself. Or it could be a sickly fairy child, which usually then would die. In most of these cases, then the person who was thought to be changed usually dies within a certain amount of time. Why did they do this? Usually to sort of reinforce their own numbers, because it was a human that they thought was especially beautiful or talented or wise or whatever, so they wanted to take the human for themselves. And at least in the case of the fairy baby was dying already, so they replaced the dying baby with one that's going to live and survive, and sort of pawn the final care of the dying baby off on humans while taking the healthy human baby. The majority of changeling stories do not involve actual fairy babies. They most often involve elderly fairies or inanimate objects. The fairy baby thing does happen. It's just, I kind of want to emphasize with where this is going, that it's not common. And of course, I've done previous videos on changelings. I don't want to get too far just into that specific folk belief. It's very dark and very grim. Some really horrific things happened to humans that had disabilities, particularly physical disabilities, because of these folk beliefs. Something to keep in mind. But that is all pretty straightforward. That is how changelings have been understood. That is how they are still understood in a lot of places. What happened in the 1990s is some articles came out suggesting, based not on anecdotal material or actual court cases involving changeling folk belief, but entirely on a story trope that had developed around changelings, which was the old fairy that wants the retirement plan, disguising itself as a human infant, and then being very loud and demanding and obnoxious, and so the mother realizes there's something not right, this isn't her baby, and eventually it is tricked in one of several ways into revealing itself. Once it reveals itself as this ancient fairy, it has to leave and the human baby has to be returned. So they took this one particular story trope and basically argued that this proved that changelings were how neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people, had been previously understood. And there's multiple layers of why this is a mess. In itself, the idea of arguing that changelings was how ignorant people understood autistic children was coming directly from the slightly older Victorian argument that changelings were how ignorant people understood children born with Down syndrome in particular. And they had a very horrifically racist argument for that, which I am not going to get into here. But just important to understand that we have this idea originally of rationally explaining changeling beliefs as people who did not know better and were not smart enough to know better, misunderstanding effectively a chromosomal birth defect with Down syndrome. And then that grew in the 1990s into this idea that it was misunderstanding people who had autism. And this then was taken more recently, particularly in the last 20 years or so, and people have started self-identifying as changelings, particularly in the autistic community. And I will say, as I always do when I talk about this, I am autistic myself. I am part of the autistic community. I have a difference of opinion with self-identifying this way, but I'm not going to get into that here either because it's not the point. I'm just putting out there that it is understood in some communities this way. And another thing that has become more widespread, particularly when the Winx Club renewal, revival, whatever you want to call it, came out recently, is the idea that a changeling is a fairy who is swapped with a human child and then grows up thinking that it's human. And usually this is coming from fiction, so usually at some point in their teens, the person realizes that they are magical and special and not actually a human, and that they are a fairy, and they find out that they're a changeling. Holly Black wrote about this in her fairy tale series. The first book, I think, is Tide in that one. And her main character is a pixie changeling who was swapped for a human child, grows up their entire life thinking that they are actually human until they are 16 or 17, and then they find out that, in fact, their human counterpart was stolen into the world of fairy, and they've been sort of living their life, that person's life, up until that point. And it goes from there. So from sources like that, from fiction, from the Winx Club, from places like that, we are now seeing this new folk belief coming out that a changeling is that they are a fairy who is raised as a human without realizing that they are human. This overlaps a little sometimes with the otherkin community, which I've also been a part of for 20 years at this point. So again, speaking as someone in the community, not just as someone poking at it, studying it. The idea that this is an explanation of someone's otherkin, that they could be a changeling, This gets additionally confused because people treat changelings as if a changeling is a type of fairy, when it's not. All sorts of different kinds of fairies, types of fairies, were known to steal humans and leave changelings. Trolls in the more Nordic areas, elves in Scotland, the Aesir, the fairies in Ireland, etc. Shakespeare talks about English fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream stealing humans, changelings. So, it was less of a type of being and more of a job description, kind of. It just meant that you had been switched for a human. And extra confusingly, even in the older folklore, the human that is stolen is also referred to as a changeling. So you have the human changeling and you have the fairy changeling, effectively. And yes, that is as confusing as it sounds like it would be. So we have the older folklore that tells us one thing about what changelings are, and then we have this newer folklore coming in, the two streams of it. We have the first stream, which is that changelings were how autistic people were understood historically, which is not the case. Maybe more the case today because of this assumption than it used to be. And then you have this idea that a changeling is a fairy that grows up as a human and then realizes it's actually a fairy. So, and I say that we know that this is not how autistic people were understood, not meaning that there are not some cases where the person could have been autistic and was labeled as a changeling, but because we do know from anecdotal material and court cases who a lot of people that were accused of changelings actually were, like what their actual medical issues were. And none of them fit the diagnostic criteria for autism. We have Bridget Cleary, who was a 26-year-old woman. She's actually the last publicly known changeling case in Ireland. She fell ill. She had bronchitis, probably had gone into pneumonia, and was thought to be a changeling and was killed by her family. We have several court cases of children who met a similar end. One of whom was a 6-year-old boy that had smallpox and was just not recovering particularly quickly or well. One of them was a girl who is thought to have had a stroke in infancy and never fully recovered from that. Another was a little boy, I want to say he was 3, who was partially paralyzed. So it was either birth trauma or some kind of birth defect. But he was partially paralyzed, and in all of these cases, the parents or the family became convinced that the human was a changeling, a fairy changeling, and that if they just inflicted enough suffering on the changeling, that the real human, quote unquote real human, would be returned. And of course, that is not what happens. They end up killing the people, and it's like I said, a very grim, dark aspect of folklore. So while it is possible that some people would have been labeled changelings that were autistic, we know that the majority of people labeled changelings had either had birth trauma or some kind of birth defect or had an illness, like I mentioned the bronchitis and smallpox as 2 examples, or similar issues along those lines, that then they were labeled changelings because of that. There's a really good book by Dr. Rose Sawyer called The Medieval Changeling, which touches on a lot of this, particularly outside of Ireland, which is not my area of expertise, and talks about sort of the range of physical, medical issues that got children labeled as changelings. I don't think she gets as much into adults. I think her main focus is babies and children, but we do find cases with adults as well. And she kind of shows the way that these beliefs were attached to a variety of different people with a variety of different issues. It was never as narrowly focused as autism, which is why I bring this up, because this new belief that says changeling was how autistic people were understood, I feel a little concerned that this is erasing all of the people who actually were accused of being changelings that clearly had non-autistic issues going on. We need to be respectful of that. No criticism to people in the autism community that self-identify this way. There's reasons that they do that. But it's just important to stay respectful as well to the historic examples of this, which often cost the person their life, being accused of being this, and an understanding that they generally had medical issues, specific types of medical issues, not necessarily autism. And the idea that you would be a fairy growing up as a human because you are a changeling. Like I said, that is something very new coming at us from fiction and other types of media. I'm not saying don't believe it, but just definitely have an understanding that the older and culture-specific folklore has a completely different understanding of who and what a changeling would have been. And that when we're talking about this, we're talking about this in a modern context. When you look at older stories, that is not what they meant. You cannot take them, and this is kind of the point of my entire video, you cannot take the modern beliefs and project them back retrospectively onto the older beliefs and then try to understand the older beliefs through that modern lens. Whether it's cold iron or changelings or whatever, it's going to cause a lot more confusion. You sort of have to have this understanding that there's these modern beliefs that are coming from very specific modern sources, and they are different from what the older or often still culturally specific beliefs are and would be. You can respect the new beliefs, you can be aware that they're there, you can believe them. That is fine, that is up to you, as I've said multiple times in this video. But don't then take that modern idea and project it back and say, this is how this belief has always been. That 500 years ago, this is also what people thought. You need to be aware when beliefs have shifted and changed, how they've evolved, how they are today, and where they're actually coming from. There's nothing wrong with having a folk belief that is coming from fiction. That is also something that's happened all across history. But you don't want to then turn around and forward that idea as this is genuinely what people believed 500 years ago, or to argue and say this is what Irish folklore says when we know for sure it's coming from an author from like Minnesota or wherever in the US who made this up, to be a fun part of their story. Again, that's fine, but that is not Irish folklore. And oftentimes, even when the culture-specific folklore is taken and incorporated into gaming, it is radically changed in order to work in the game. White Wolf's Changeling game with their Seelie and Unseelie courts have really rewritten what the Seelie and Unseelie courts are, not to mention pretty much all the backstory with everything fairy that's involved in those books. But people take that then and are like, well, this is the folk belief around the Unseelie court. And it is not. It's very profoundly not. It is coming from a US role-playing game. So just need to have a little awareness of that, and hopefully this is what the person on social media who asked me to do this video wanted and was looking for, just talking about the way these beliefs change, where they are today. And again, the vast majority of everything I've said is stuff that is coming either directly from fiction and gaming, coming from the United States, or coming from other sources, often in the United States, that are disconnected from these core cultures. They're disconnected from these beliefs, and they are almost all coming from people who don't actually believe any of this. These are not people who believe in these beings, who have had experiences themselves, for the most part, writing about these things. These are people who are writing stories that are meant to be entertaining fictional stories, and that is all that they're focused on. Except to Dane McCoy. I really don't know where she was coming from with many things that she said. She also has a whole book on moon magic where she talks about that the Unseelie are perfectly nice and just need a hug and a friend, which is one of the most horrifying things I've ever read in a pagan book. So I don't know where she was getting her stuff. Maybe that was all just her personal ideas, but it all gets framed as older, genuine folk belief. And we just have to be super clear that that's not what's happening. That's not what that is. And that the modern ideas are modern. They are new. Still folk beliefs, but very distinct and separate from the sources that they claim that they're coming from. So, I know that's 45 minutes of me basically repeating the same point over and over. Hopefully, though, people found it interesting and entertaining, and hopefully going forward, when you run across things in the wilds of the internet, maybe take an extra minute to just research a little, try to check your sources, check and see where stuff is coming from. By all means, I am all over social media, Facebook, Instagram, as we've established, TikTok, unfortunately, all of these places. So if you run across something and you're honestly not sure, like, is this actually older folklore, is it new, you can reach out to me on social media. I am a single parent and I do work for a living. I mean, I write, but it's still work. So I might not respond like 5 minutes after you message me, but I will do my best to get to it and to offer some clarification if it's something I know about, or potentially some sources to look at if it's something I don't. Fairies might be my main focus, but there's so much fairy lore out there. I am a little more narrowly focused on Ireland and the UK sort of more broadly. So Ireland, and then, you know, the UK separately. The beliefs would be different for the most part. Northern Ireland is in there, but that also gets a little messy. So anything that would fall into like the Irish or Great Britain realm of things, and then less so like the Icelandic and the Norse. But outside of that, if we're talking French or Italian or Spanish, Portuguese, other areas of Europe, I am not going to be your main resource for that, but I will try to help you find a better resource if that's sort of the area that you're asking about. So that all said, I'm going to wrap this up for today. I will try to get back next month with another video. If you have a specific topic you would like to see me talk about, or a question that would make a good topic for a video, please feel free to drop it in the comments, and I will look at getting around to it as soon as I have a chance.